That is what was being discussed in Congress in 2011, 8.5 years ago. So while Mike Pompeo was there, he was told to do exactly what Mike Pompeo eventually did in partnership with Trump as Secretary of State. He was told that assassinations are easier because you don't have to bother with getting approval, which they didn't bother to get. He was told that you don't have to build a consensus and make your case. And there was no consensus, domestically or internationally. No one was consulted, not even Iraq, even though the bomb was to be dropped on their land. He was told to just go after Soleimani when he travels, and they killed him at the airport. This plan has been kicked around for almost 9 years. In Trump and Pompeo's explanations, you heard them rattle off a list of Soleimani's past sins, but specifics of an imminent threat that had to be taken care of with a 9-year-old assassination idea? I have my doubts. And so did Congress.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my darling friend, and thank you for tuning into the 208th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Today's episode is going to be a nice, light topic in these turbulent times. Today, we're going to be talking about war. Because this year started off with a World War III threat. Because on January 3rd, and I know this seems like a million years ago with everything that's gone down, but it was only a month ago that President Donald Trump, as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, a senior military official in the Iranian government, a country we are not at war with, and he carried out the execution by bombing a different country, Iraq, a country that we recently overthrew, but whose government is supposed to belong to Iraqis now. Now, when this assassination was carried out, the bomb was dropped on a car that was driving Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport. And the bomb also killed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. I don't know how to say names, but this guy was important. He was the second in command of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, which is a part of Iraq's official military. And this means that President Trump assassinated leaders of two countries with one bomb and did this in our names and on our own, because the United Nations was not consulted in this. And so this move did not have the backing of the world. Under the United Nations Charter, so according to the international laws that we helped write and are supposed to adhere to, we're not allowed to use force in another country without that country's consent or without the authorization of the UN Security Council, unless the use of force is in self-defense or is to prevent an imminent attack, which for most rational beings implies that it's a 24, like Jack Bauer needs to stop the bomb from going off situation. In this case, Iraq was not asked and did not give the Trump administration permission to bomb their airport. And the UN Security Council was not asked and therefore also did not give the United States permission to bomb. And was there an imminent threat? Well, the answer to that depends entirely upon whether or not you trust the words of Donald Trump and those who work for him, because words are all we've been given. And the words, well, you'll hear them soon. And so internationally, the legality of this is highly questionable. In fact, its legality here in the States is not all that clear either, because Trump didn't even bother to tell members of Congress before he did it. Forget about them declaring war, as they are constitutionally supposed to be the ones to do. And since we overthrew recently Iraq and never took our troops out of there, I mean, not really, I don't think you need a dream team of lawyers to argue that we're still on a war-like footing in Iraq. But Iran assassinating one of their senior officials? You know, murder is still illegal in U.S. law, even for the president, and no war has been declared on Iran. The authorization for the use of military force that was passed just after 9/11, and that has been used to legally justify the bombing of a whole bunch of countries, Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen. Well, that authorization for the use of military force can only be twisted to say that it's authorizing the murder of terrorists, rogue humans who don't work for any government. But nothing authorizes the assassination of foreign government officials, except for maybe a declaration of war, which we don't have. which is why this is considered by many around the world, myself included, to be a serious act of war. And we don't know if it's legal or why the Trump administration might think it's legal. Because when he did notify Congress, Trump gave them his legal justification in a classified report, which is not normal. The public in the past has been privy to legal justifications for acts of war. And the legal justification that was instead given to members of Congress in a classified briefing a week after the bombing, well, the Trump administration said that they had authority because of the 2002 authorization for the use of military force for the Iraq war. But that only authorizes the force against the government of Saddam Hussein, who has been dead for a very long time. And it also authorizes, quote, against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, unquote, not Iran. So this looks all kinds of illegal and far more consequential than anything involving that ridiculous impeachment cluster that's been headlining the last month since the bombing. Already, it's only been a month, and it feels like this bombing took place years ago. But it didn't. We're still in the middle of this. And so today I'm going to tell you the story as I know it so far. And in doing so, we're also going to examine what Congress actually has authorized in this year's war authorization in relation to Iran, Iraq, and Syria, since Iran is all up in all those three countries. Okay, so let's get started. Now, this is going to be so simplistic, but basically, what we in the U.S. need to understand is that in the Middle East, in the region of Iraq, Iran, Syria, and that part of the world, and actually in the whole world, there are different groups of Muslims. So just like there are Catholic churches and Christian churches and Protestant churches that are supposedly different, but when you get dragged into one of their services, they're all preaching Jesus, and everything in them sounds pretty much the same. They even sing the same songs. Well, just like there's different groups of the Jesus lovers, there are different groups of Muslims. And the two main groups are Shiites and Sunnis. Now, the Iranian government is on Team Shiite. And for 3 decades, the religious government of Iran has been trying to build a Shiite sphere of influence that stretches from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So they would have a big goal strip of control in the Middle East. And the goal is progressing for them quite nicely. In Iraq, thanks to George W. Bush overthrowing Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated government, the government is now Shiite-dominated, just like in Iran. And Syria, which is still controlled by President Bashar al-Assad, who we've been trying to overthrow since mid-Obama years, well, Syria has a lot of Sunnis, but President Assad's religion is a brand of Shia also, and he's been allied with Iran in his fight against the U.S., who has been trying to overthrow him for many years now. On the other side of Syria, Iran is also allied with Lebanon, which is Israel's north side neighbor. And this line of countries, they call the Axis of Resistance. It's an alliance of these 4 countries that gives Iran real regional power. It forms a fat dividing line right through the Middle East. Now, most Americans, in my experience, don't give a if Iran forms an axis of resistance in the Middle East. It's their neighborhood. We don't give a shit. But our government has been controlled by oil men for so long that preventing this axis of resistance that Iran has influence over, well, this has been a centerpiece of our foreign policy since before my parents were born. Because oil remains the reason that any powerful people in the United States give 2 hot shits about Iran. Because back in the day, America's daddy, the United Kingdom, had control over Iran's oil. They had control of Iran's oil for 4 decades. But in the early 1950s, Mohammad Mossadegh became Iran's prime minister, and he thought that the British taking more than half of Iran's oil wealth was unfair to the people of Iran. And so he wanted to negotiate a fair deal, but the British refused to split the oil revenue evenly with the Iranians. And so on May 1st, 1952, after a unanimous vote in support of doing so by the Iranian parliament, Prime Minister Mossadegh ordered the seizure of the British's Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So he ordered the Iranian government to take the British's oil company over so that the oil money could be used within Iran and the Iranians could use it to pay for the things that we commonly pay for with income taxes. But by this time, a new branch of the United States government had been created, one that has been allowed to operate secretly and with no consequences for lawbreaking since its creation, the Central Intelligence Agency. And so the year after Iran nationalized their oil, the CIA and the UK's version of secret police, the MI6, they overthrew Iran's government by forcing Prime Minister Mossadegh out of the country in an operation that they called Operation Ajax in order to give the multinationals control of the oil once again. Basically, the way it went down is that the CIA orchestrated protests. The Prime Minister Mossadegh's home was attacked by CIA-controlled members of the military. And after he fled for his safety, a new prime minister that was USA and British approved was installed by the Iranian monarchy. And all of this has actually been confirmed by the CIA. And so the new government was a government led by one particularly powerful family, in this case, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And the new government made a 25-year deal with the multinational oil companies, and the deal gave them half of Iran's oil profits and gave the multinationals the power to determine how much oil would be pumped out of and sold from Iran. That deal was valid since the coup until 1979. But in 1979, the Shah's government was overthrown and religious Islamic Republic leaders took control of the country, undemocratically for what it's worth. In 1979 was also the same time when the oil deal with the multinationals was expiring, and when the deal expired, the Iranians chose not to renew it, and they nationalized much of their oil industry again. Around the same time, the Iranians took 52 American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Iran and held them for 444 days. They were all released, unharmed, but the act has never been forgiven by many of the masters of the universe. And this was when we first declared an economic war on Iran, which has continued to this day. The first batch of sanctions, which are economic war attacks, prohibited Iranian products from being sold in the United States, and the U.S. froze $12 billion in Iranian assets, which means that the United States essentially ordered the banks to keep Iran's money from them. It's like if the government ordered your bank to prohibit you from accessing your own money in your own account. That's what sanctions do. And so in 1979, the new Iranian government, we declared economic war on it. And then in September of 1980, in the middle of the 444 days of the hostage crisis, Iraq, led then by Saddam Hussein, who we provided with money and horrific weapons, well, Saddam invaded Iran in an attempt to take it over, while it was still chaotic from the overthrow of its government just a year before. This was the start of the 8-year Iraq-Iran war, a neighbor versus neighbor war which killed over 1 million people, but which in the end legitimized the Islamic Iranian government, which got its land back from Iraq and ended the war with its power. And just a side note here, like I said, we gave Iraq weapons during that war. The Reagan administration, however, also gave weapons to Iran. Remember the Iran-Contra scandal? The CIA sold weapons to Iran in that scandal in order to fund a secret war in Nicaragua, something that Congress specifically said in a law they were not allowed to do. And no one was held accountable for that. In fact, one of the people who was all up in that illegal action, Elliot Abrams, is now in charge of the Trump administration's ongoing regime change attempts in Venezuela. And so these people have not been held accountable and they haven't gone away. But anyway, we funded both sides of that war. And in July of 1988, in the middle of the war, towards the end of the war, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down an Iranian passenger jet, Iran Air Flight 655, that killed all 290 people on board. And in one of the scarier moments after this recent assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Trump tweeted that his office had made a list of 52 Iranian sites to bomb, representing the 52 hostages taken in 1979. Iran's president tweeted back at him, quote, "Those who refer to the number 52 should also remember the number 290. Never threaten the Iranian nation," unquote. That flight that we shot down, that's what the 290 was referring to. And to add insult to 290 deaths, by the way, the Navy captain who accidentally shot down the plane was given a medal. And the Iranians are well aware of that as well. A few years after that war ended in 1991, George Poppy Bush invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War. And we know that Saddam was allowed at the end of all the bombing and destruction to remain in power. One of the reasons was the fear that if Saddam, whose government was dominated by Sunnis, was removed, it would be replaced by a government of Shiites. Again, the Iranian government is Shiite, and so that could greatly increase the power of Iran since there would be a natural partnership there. During the next administration, on March 15, 1995, President Clinton declared a state of emergency with respect to Iran, officially because of Iran's nuclear weapons program. They would like to have a nuclear weapon so that we don't overthrow them. And in that same executive order that declared the emergency, that prohibited U.S. investment in Iran's oil industry. In the oil industry, which is a curious thing to target if you're trying to stop a nuclear weapons program. And in April 1996, Congress made Clinton's economic war on Iran's oil industry official by passing the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act of 1996, which Clinton signed, of course, punishing domestic and foreign companies that invest more than $40 million a year in Iran's oil industry. It just goes to show that even when the masters of the universe have said their problem with Iran is about other things, in this case nuclear weapons, oil has always been at the center of it. But the state of emergency declared by Bill Clinton in 1995 has been extended for a year every single March since then, which means that next month will probably be the 25th year of this so-called emergency. Which brings me to 2001, when we had an actual emergency, 9/11. Exactly 7 days after the towers fell, Congress and President W. enacted the one-paragraph authorization for the use of military force that shall live in infamy. It said, quote, "The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force," which is quite broad, "against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons," which is a broad definition of who can be targeted, "in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons," unquote. I guess that was an exact quote since I had a few comments in there, but you get what I'm saying. They passed that paragraph, and it has been twisted to allow 3 presidents, W, Obama, and Trump, to bomb at least 6 countries by saying that the targets were somehow connected to terrorists that were even remotely connected to anyone involved in 9/11. But the truth is that we don't know who they've bombed or how many people have died. And this is because our shameful excuses for Congresses have done nothing to rein in the power to kill that horrific paragraph in law unleashed. And the first target of this paragraph was officially Afghanistan. Starting in late 2001, we overthrew the Taliban government in Afghanistan and tried to remake Afghanistan into, well, that's the thing. We don't know. In this episode's show notes, there is an article by Craig Whitlock of the Washington Post about the Afghanistan papers, which in the past would have been a major scandal, but in these crazy times was largely ignored by the corporate media funded by ads paid for by war profiteering companies. But basically, the Washington Post got a hold of thousands of secret documents about Afghanistan and fought the government for 3 years to release the information within them. And the basic gist of what we found out in the Afghanistan papers is that from the beginning, the military made up statistics to make it look like we were winning the war and reshaping the country when we never actually were. We were constantly lied to about Afghanistan. The truth is that if you have that feeling like you never really understood what we were doing in Afghanistan, if you never really got the goal, well, you're not just some lazy citizen who wasn't doing your due diligence in holding your government accountable. Starting with Donald Rumsfeld himself, George W. Bush's defense secretary who launched the Afghanistan war, right down to the troops in Afghanistan doing the work. None of them knew what the hell they were trying to accomplish there. There was never a coherent strategy. Some people wanted to make Afghanistan a democracy. In other words, they wanted to transform Afghanistan into a market economy in order to integrate it with the world trade system so that multinationals could operate and profit freely from Afghanistan's resources. Other people wanted to change Afghanistan's culture to give women more rights. Others wanted the main goal to be to use Afghanistan as a staging area for battling Iran, Russia, Pakistan, the other neighboring countries for regional dominance in a region that we don't live in. There were so many different goals and priorities that it added up to no strategy at all. And since there was no strategy, the peasants' shoulders on the ground didn't know who the good guys were and didn't know who the bad guys were. And so if you don't know what you're trying to do, how do you determine sides? You know? And so no one seems to have ever figured that out. And we still have 13,000 American troops in Afghanistan, and Christ only knows how many contractors who are private for-profit mercenaries that we pay so much more than our actual military members in order to add fighters to our wars without the public knowing the true numbers, and to funnel money to the masters of the universe that own these mercenary companies and profit directly from war. But even after the release of the Afghanistan papers, there doesn't seem to be any real effort right now, at least, to get us out of there. It's like Congress has just accepted this as a forever war. And I could go on about this for another hour, which I think I'm going to do in another episode. But for today's purpose, the Afghanistan cluster made us partners in the beginning with Iran. Iran helped us with overthrowing Afghanistan because they were enemies with the Taliban. And while they were partners with us in the Afghanistan war, Iran actually stopped enriching uranium for nuclear weapons. There was real cause for hope that Iran could move out of the enemy category until George W. Bush opened his stupid mouth. Because in early 2002, during Bush's State of the Union, Iran was named, along with Iraq and North Korea, as part of the Axis of Evil. And so with that one phrase, any thoughts the Iranians were having about a possible partnership with the United States were destroyed because George W. Bush, on the most public of stages, gave the Iranians a legitimate reason to think that they could be on the regime change target list. And as we now know, thanks to General Wesley Clark, they were.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second. I said, well, you're too busy. He said, no. He says, we've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq. This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. He said, I guess they don't know what else to do. So I said, well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda? He said, no. He says, there's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq. He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
And in 2003, they started knocking countries off that list. First up, we overthrew Saddam's Sunni government in Iraq. And the resulting new government was dominated by Shiites, and ever since, the Iraqi government has had to do a balancing act of pleasing its two masters, their overthrowers, us, and the Iranians, who they have a natural partnership with because of their Shiiteness and their long shared border. This is exactly the result that was predicted by Poppy Bush's warmongers in the 1990s. We basically overthrew all of Iran's neighboring enemies for them, and now our warmongers are concerned that we may have whoopsied them into having too much power. But after watching their next-door neighbor get violently overthrown despite their growing power in the region, in late 2005, after the W. Bush administration, John Bolton in particular, sabotaged Iran's chances of getting anything in return for stopping their nuclear program, Iran started it back up again after a 3-year hiatus. Then in December 2006, 10 years after President Clinton declared an emergency because of Iran's nuclear weapon program and declared economic war on Iran's oil industry, the UN Security Council, so the legit rest of the world, imposed sanctions on Iran's trade in nuclear-related materials. So they put sanctions on things that made sense if the effort is really to stop Iran's nuclear weapon development. 4 months after that, in March 2007, the UN Security Council expanded the economic war to include Iran's weapons industry, a target that also makes sense if you're concerned about weapons more than economics. But then in October of 2007, 7 months after the world collectively sanctioned Iran's weapons, the W. Bush administration, around the time a lot of us were carrying signs at protests telling Bush not to bomb Iran, well, around that time, the Bush administration enacted more U.S.-only sanctions, which cut off a bunch of Iranian organizations, including 3 major banks, from the U.S. financial system. And so the world was focused on weapons. And once again, our government targeted money, their economy. This is what is done when the goal is not specific and is instead aimed at hurting the government in general, setting the stage for the people to get pissed off at their own government because they're miserable and can't make money. And we hope that they will overthrow the government for us. Banking sanctions are particularly effective for this regime change strategy because they mean that multinational banks can't process Iranian government financial transactions, which shuts off all kinds of business transactions. And asset freezes prevent the banks from giving Iranians their own money. The George W. Bush administration was the first to try this in Iran at the same time that things were happening like John McCain singing this little ditty.
That old Beach Boys song, Bomb Iran. Bomb, 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 bomb. Anyway.
Things were ratcheting up. It's been over a decade, and I think some of us forget what it felt like at the end of the Bush years. But one of the reasons that a lot of us were terrified of a John McCain presidency in that election was because of Iran. We thought that we were going to go to war in Iran again. And so this type of stuff continued. There were more and more sanctions until we elected President Barack Obama, whose administration really did do something that could have led to a better world. Because in July 2015, the Obama administration signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. In return for easing up on the economic war, Iran agreed to basically stop working on their nuclear weapon creation projects. And this deal wasn't a US-only deal or even some world trade system type thing. It really was global. It was negotiated by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, China, and Russia, two of Iran's allies that we commonly hear are our enemies lately, even though I think that a lot of us, myself 100% included, don't consider either China or Russia our enemies simply because they're running their economies differently and have stopped their allies from being overthrown by us. But the point is that both China, Russia, and Iran obviously signed a deal with us and some of our closest allies that got Iran to actually stop developing nuclear weapons. One of the key benefits for Iran after it was certified in January 2016 that Iran was complying with the deal and had in fact shut off their nuclear weapon production line, the U.S. stopped enforcing our energy sanctions. We called off the economic war on Iran's oil industry and set loose some of the many billions of Iran's money that Clinton and W had been forcing the banks to hold hostage. But then in November of 2016, the American people voted for Donald Trump for president. In some ways, this could have been considered a good thing for Iran, since Iran was helping the Syrian government defend itself from the groups of randoms that we were funding, or I should say the Obama administration, was funding in order to overthrow Syria, a war that the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton had promised the world that she would double down on if elected. But Donald Trump stuffed his administration with Iran-obsessed psychopaths. In particular, he made Mike Pompeo his first CIA director. A few months after being confirmed as CIA director by a Senate that should have known better, because Mike Pompeo was literally a Koch brothers oil business partner who was sent to Congress thanks to hundreds of thousands of their dollars and who loyally did their bidding while he was a low-level nobody of a congressman in the House of Representatives. Well, after he became CIA director in June of 2017, Mike Pompeo set up an Iran mission center at the CIA, which is the same lawless agency that overthrew the Iranian government in 1953. The Wall Street Journal reported at the time that this mission center would coordinate covert actions in Iran. And also, just FYI, Pompeo set up one of these mission centers first for North Korea the month before he did it for Iran. Then, in August 2017, Congress also exhibited belligerence towards Iran in a bill that was written in May 2017 that I highlighted in episode 156. Well, Congress, by a vote of 413-3 in the House and 98-2 in the Senate, teamed up with Trump to enact sanctions on Russia, North Korea, and Iran. The main targets, as you can hear in the episode I produced at the time, was clearly Russia, since the Democrats have wrongly decided that being all in for a new Cold War is a good look for them. And also North Korea was a target because they actually are run by a dictator. Crazy situation there. But Iran was included in the same sanctioned law. And in this election year, I do think it's worth highlighting that one of the only 2 noes cast in the Senate was by Senator Bernie Sanders, who voted against the bill specifically because the Iran sanctions were included in it, and he didn't want them to destroy the nuclear deal, which was working, and then put us on a path towards a war. The sanctions, however, passed because Bernie was outnumbered. And they were directed at any person or company in the U.S. that equips Iran's military, which was a congressionally approved breaking of our side of the Iran deal. And despite Iran being consistently found to be in compliance with their end of the nuclear deal. And the thing is, this was a dick move on our part. So this clip I'm about to play for you is from a hearing that took place just a couple weeks ago after President Trump assassinated Soleimani at the Baghdad airport. Congress had called Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to testify, but he was too chicken shit to answer any questions under oath, and he refused to show up. He's been refusing to appear before Congress a lot lately. So since they couldn't get Pompeo to testify about why they bombed people in Baghdad, Congress called the real masters of the universe to testify. In particular, they called Richard Haass, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the world's most powerful private think tank, sometimes accurately referred to as Wall Street's think tank, where world leaders routinely go to plot their plans for world domination. Which is not a joke. I'm not exaggerating. That's actually what they do. It's so creepy. Also at this hearing were Avril Haines, who was one of the leaders of the CIA during the Obama years, and Stephen Hadley, one of George W. Bush's national security advisors, who's currently on the board of directors at Raytheon, the same company that our defense secretary, Mark Esper, was the head lobbyist for before Trump picked him to be head war maker. I just want to marinate on this for a second, though, because Stephen Hadley, a war profiteer, was asked to Congress for his advice on what to do about Trump possibly bumblefucking us into a war with Iran. And that type of corporate influence in our congressional decisions would be shocking if it weren't so goddamn routine. But regardless, All three of these war-loving monsters said this in response to a question posed by Representative Adriano Espaillat, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, of New York.
My questions to you individually, and this is a yes or no answer question, is whether or not you feel or you gather enough information or evidence that from the inspectors or otherwise that you feel that Iran comply with the provisions established by the JCPOA. Mr. Haas, do you feel that they comply? Yes or no?
Based on everything I've read, the international inspectors made the case that Iran was in compliance.
Ms. Haynes?
Yes, same.
Mr. Hatley?
So far as I know, yes.
So everyone, even now, knows and openly acknowledges that Iran kept their end of that deal. But it didn't stop President Donald Trump from ripping up the Iran nuclear deal in May of 2018, 1 month after Mike Pompeo had moved from CIA director to Secretary of State. And so here's Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State on May 23, 2018, testifying to the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
On Monday, I unveiled a new direction for the president's Iran strategy. We will apply unprecedented financial pressure, coordinate with our DoD colleagues on deterrence efforts, support the Iranian people, perhaps most importantly, and hold out the prospect for a new deal with Iran. It simply needs to change its behavior.
So they wanted a new deal with Iran. They didn't like the one negotiated by President Obama, despite the fact that it was definitely working as intended. And so for the new deal, Mike Pompeo laid out 12 demands that Iran would have to agree to, which included ending their support for people fighting in Lebanon, Yemen, and on the territories that should be Palestine. They would have to withdraw every Iranian fighter from Syria and Afghanistan. They'd have to stop producing all missiles. I mean, they basically demanded that Iran have no involvement in any of their neighboring countries and basically let us do whatever we want in the region. I considered their demands, after hearing them, quite unreasonable, especially when made without any input from the rest of the world. And you can hear the 12 demands straight out of Mike Pompeo's bloated face in Congressional Dish 175, State of War. But even in that speech, where he laid out all the demands, Pompeo admitted that they really weren't looking for a deal.
President Trump said 2 weeks ago he is ready, willing, and able to negotiate a new deal. But the deal is not the objective. Our goal is to protect the American people.
Whatever that means. But a deal is not the objective. So what is? And the truth is, I honestly don't know. All I know for sure is that pulling out was a Trump administration move. They were completely alone in it. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China were original signatories on that deal, and none of them supported the withdrawal. And Congress certainly never passed a law making him pull out of the deal. In fact, Congress never ratified the deal as a treaty like they're supposed to with international agreements like that. But just like with the World Trade System creating trade agreements, they skip the proper treaty process simply by not calling them treaties, even though they're fucking treaties. And so listen to the Fast Track episode if you want to know what I'm talking about with all that, because Congress and Trump just signed another trade agreement into law, the US, Mexico, Canada one, the new NAFTA, and they used Fast Track to do it. And it's bullshit. And it makes me mad. Episode 96. And yes, I'll follow up on this too after I finish with the war episodes. This horrible Congress did all of their most important work in the course of 3 days and literally thousands of pages of legislation in December. And so it's going to take me a while to catch up. But yes, that happened. But the point, which I will get back to, is that Congress never ratified the Iran nuclear deal as a treaty, but also didn't in any way direct Trump to get out of it. This was a Trump move. The responsibility for this really does rest 100% with him and the dipshits that he has surrounded himself with. And when he pulled us out of the deal, he did it not just by breaking our end of the deal, but smashing our end of the deal into a fine dust, which he then, snorted with one of the old McDonald's straws littering his desk. Oh, this is the greatest Obama accomplishment I've ever snorted. Believe me, it's incredible. Smells like covfefe. Oh, God. Anyway, after Trump snorted the dust of our end of the JCPOA, Trump started a maximum pressure campaign to cut Iran off from the rest of the world economically. And so here's Mike Pompeo again speaking to the war-loving psychos at the Heritage Foundation on May 21st, 2018.
We will apply unprecedented financial pressure on the Iranian regime. Sanctions are going back in full effect and new ones are coming. These will indeed end up being the strongest sanctions in history when we are complete.
And just like he promised the Heritage Foundation psychos, the Trump administration then reinstalled banking sanctions, economic war attacks that prevent banks from processing Iranian government transactions. But the Trumpers also applied them not only to U.S. banks, but to foreign banks as well, basically to all multinationals. That's an economic war escalation beyond what was happening even before the Iran deal. And of course, the Trump administration, led by the Koch brothers' oily bitch, Mike Pompeo, also reinstated the Iran oil sanctions. And the result has been that Iran has lost 90% of its oil exports. As a result of the combination of the banking sanctions and the oil sanctions, Iran's currency has plummeted and inflation is over 35% there, with food prices rising twice as much. Iran's president recently estimated that our economic war has cost them $200 billion in the less than 2 years since Trump pulled out of the deal. So mission accomplished if the goal is to cripple Iran's economy. But there's an interesting side effect here. In an attempt to keep the nuclear agreement alive and to go around Trump and his dum-dums, France, Germany, and the UK set up a side system called Instex, INSTEX, to trade with Iran outside of the US banking system. Now, it's only meant for trading food and medicine, but the important thing is that it was set up at all. Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal caused 3 of our closest allies, France, Germany, and the UK, to set up a trading system that leaves the US dollar and the US financial system out of it in order to avoid Trump's sanctions. A system like this, set up by our allies of all people, was unimaginable 4 years ago. And it's gotten damn near no coverage here inside the United States. But in the context of the world order that we set up and we've been the center of since World War II, this is a huge deal. And not only does Instex exist, the system is already operational and expanding. 6 more countries, Belgium, which is home to the EU headquarters, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, have all signed up to use the Instex system, and all EU members have been told that they're welcome to join. Also, the Instex countries are all openly discussing the prospect of using it to trade oil. Now, the main reason why we get away with our most evil shit is because oil is traded in US dollars, which gives the US dollar enormous power. We have overthrown countries for even attempting to trade oil in anything other than dollars. Listen to episode 131, Bombing Libya, for more information about that. And now we have 9 European countries in real negotiations to trade outside of the US banking system and talking about doing so for trading oil, not just food and medicine. That is an existential threat to the people who want the US elites to be the undisputed masters of the universe. And the Trumpers, even though they're the cause of this, they do at least seem to be aware of this effect because Trump is threatening to sanction countries who use the Instex system. But that's the thing. U.S. sanctions only have power as long as U.S. multinational banks are at the center of the global financial system. But this separate system would allow all of these European countries and anyone else they choose to let participate tell the U.S. to go ahead and fuck ourselves with our sanctions. Sanctions is a tool that we have allowed our leaders to abuse, and now they're on their way to losing it. This is one of those things that I feel like we should all be much more aware of. So keep an eye out for anything you hear about Instex, the EU side of that trading system. And then the Iranian side is called the Special Trade and Finance Institute. And so if that ends up on your radar, please tweet me whatever you see at Jen Briney, because that is a bigger deal than I think most of us are aware of. So basically, Trump broke our end of the Iran nuclear deal and went full shock and awe with an economic war in May 2018. It was the dickiest of moves. And knowing as we do how beholden Koch brothers Congressman Mike Pompeo is to the fossil fuel industry that wants the Iranian oil, it's not crazy to wonder if war is the ultimate goal, because here's Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, testifying to Congress 2 weeks ago on January 14th.
Here I would highlight the American decision in 2018 to exit the 2015 nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and the decision to introduce significant sanctions against Iran. These sanctions constituted a form of economic warfare. Iran was not in a position to respond in kind and instead instituted a series of military actions meant to make the United States and others pay a price for these sanctions, and therefore to conclude they needed to be removed. It is also important, I believe, to point out here that the United States did not provide a diplomatic alternative to Iran when it imposed these sanctions.
That is the president of the oh-so-powerful Council on Foreign Relations, saying that Iran wasn't given any way to talk themselves out of the Trump economic war. He even straight up called it an economic war. The Trump administration launched the most severe economic war in history, their own description, against Iran, and gave them no way diplomatically to get out of it. They even said a deal wasn't their goal. And on top of that, in April of last year, Trump designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, including the Quds Force, which is Iran's actual military, as a foreign terrorist organization. In the declaration, the Trump administration, well, first of all, spells Quds Force wrong and said that the decision was led by the State Department, which means Mike Pompeo. The statement itself also pointed out that this was the first time the United States has ever officially labeled another country's actual military as a foreign terrorist organization and called the move unprecedented. So they essentially bragged about how extreme a move this is. In return, Iran declared that the United States is a state sponsor of terrorism and labeled our military members in the Middle East terrorist groups. So we're all terrorists now. Remember that 2001 authorization for the use of military force that authorizes the use of force against terrorists? Well, we're seeing the precedent that's set for the world right now. You're a terrorist. I'm a terrorist. Your troops are terrorists. Our troops are terrorists. We're all terrorists. And that means all kinds of uses of force that used to be illegal are now fair game. And there were plenty of other warning signs last year that we are marching towards a full-blown war with Iran. On May 5th, then National Security Advisor John Bolton, a man who has been openly pushing for a forced regime change in Iran for years.
Our goal should be regime change in Iran.
Well, as one of Trump's chief advisors in war, Bolton announced that we would be sending an aircraft carrier and Air Force bombers to the Middle East, quote, to send a clear and unmistakable message to the Iranian regime that any attack on the United States interests or on those of our allies will be met with unrelenting force, unquote. Which broke yet another precedent because it is not normal for the United States to name specific countries that we're not at war with when we deploy aircraft carriers and troops. This was a direct threat made by a psycho with an aircraft carrier. And in reality, they didn't stop at one aircraft carrier. This is Raytheon head lobbyist turned defense secretary Mark Esper testifying to Congress on December 11th, less than 2 months ago.
Since May of this year, nearly 14,000 U.S. military personnel have deployed to the region to serve as a tangible demonstration of our commitment to our allies and our partners. These additional forces are not intended to signal an escalation, but rather to reassure our friends and buttress our efforts at deterrence.
Notice how he immediately says it's not an escalation, but that means it totally is. It's like saying, I don't really care for black people. I'm not intending to signal that I'm a racist, but rather I'm reassuring my white friends that I'm clearly a racist and it's cool. 14,000 armed American humans being quietly sent to Iran's neighborhood in the last 8 months. That is an escalation. Reassure and deter, that's the spin. And we've seen those exact words before. European Reassurance Initiative, anyone? Which is the military buildup on Russia's border that started right after the Ukraine regime change in 2014. You know, the name was changed in the 2017 NDAA to the European Deterrence Initiative. And if this sounds familiar, or if it doesn't, episode 141 is when I found out about all this and we had our what the hell moment about the existence of that military buildup that the news never bothered to tell us about. And quick tangent here, in the NDAA, I have discovered that the funding for the European Reassurance/Deterrence Initiative, aka the military buildup on Russia's border, has jumped dramatically in the Trump years. It got under $1 billion per year at the end of the Obama years, but is now getting 6 times that much per year in 2019 and 2020. $6 billion a year in almost 10,000 troops. And that's twice as many troops as were there when Obama left office. So that's another Trump years escalation that I wasn't aware of because no one is telling us. But notice the terms, reassurance and deterrence. They like those words. So just keep your spidey sense up whenever watching the news, because you'll hear the official spin everywhere. And the clip you just heard is the moment when the Raytheon lobbyist turned head warmaker gave the propaganda command to his partners in Congress.
These additional forces are not intended to signal an escalation, but rather to reassure our friends and buttress our efforts at deterrence.
So that's the line. And that's what has been repeated over and over and over again. It's all for reassurance. It's all for deterrence. Don't even worry about it. So We have 14,000 more troops in the Middle East. And in May 2019, the same month the military buildup began, the fossil fuel industry was attacked. On May 12th, 4 oil ships were damaged. 2 of them were Saudi, 1 was Norwegian, and 1 was from the United Arab Emirates. But let's get real, they're multinationals. The United States blamed Iran for this, even though Iran denied doing it. Then 2 days later, Yemen's Houthis, who are in a war with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, a war that we are helping the Saudis with. So episode 195, Yemen, if you want to know about that. Well, the Houthis used drones to attack a major Saudi oil field and processing facility, which also shut down a major oil pipeline. The Saudis blamed Iran. Iran again denied doing it. 5 days later, a rocket landed near the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. Didn't hit anything, no one was hurt, and no one knows who fired it. Regardless, Trump tweeted, quote, "If Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again!" Exclamation point, unquote. Then the next month, June 13, 2 more fossil fuel ships were damaged in the Gulf of Oman. Once again, Mike Pompeo blamed Iran, again offering no evidence whatsoever, and Iran again denied doing it. June 20th, a week later, Iran shot down one of our spy drones. Iran confirmed that they did it. Iran said that the drone was flying in Iranian airspace, but the Trump administration said, nah. And so the next day, Trump said on Twitter that he personally intervened to stop a military attack on Iran in response to the flying spy robot being shot down. Trump said, quote, "We were cocked and ready to retaliate last night on 3 different sites when I asked how many will die. 150 people, sir, was the answer from a general. 10 minutes before the strike, I stopped it, not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned drone," unquote. And by the way, he spelled sites wrong. He's a very stable genius. Then, 2 days later, June 22nd, Iran executed, as in killed, an Iranian war contractor because the contractor confessed to spying for the CIA in return for money. The same week, the Iranians bragged that it had dismantled a CIA spying network, saying that they had carried out the operation with foreign allies, but they didn't name which countries they were referring to. And it's interesting that the CIA was specifically named, especially considering the CIA's proven history of overthrowing this particular government. Let's also keep in mind that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is a CIA man. He was the head of the CIA before being handed our State Department. And he set up a whole office for the CIA for performing covert operations, secret missions in Iran. And so the death of a CIA informant and maybe a whole operation being exposed and stopped, I doubt the spooks were pleased. And so then the next month, July 2019, Iran passed the uranium enrichment cap that was set by the Iran nuclear deal, officially breaking their end of the already broken by Trump deal for the first time. Also in July, the British captured an Iranian oil tanker, accusing them of bringing oil to Syria in defiance of EU sanctions. 2 weeks later, in response, Iran captured a British oil tanker. So you took one of our ships, we'll take one of yours. Na 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 na. And so the British announced that in response, they would from now on deploy their navy to escort all British-flagged multinational corporations' oil ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which is on Iran's border. Then in August, a month later, the British announced that they would let the Iranian oil tanker go, even though the Trump administration wanted the British to keep it. We also found out after the fact that the State Department, so Mike Pompeo, then tried to bribe the captain of the oil ship with several $1 million if he would steer the ship towards a country where it could be recaptured by Trump and friends. The captain refused the offer and was personally hit with sanctions instead, which means that this dude can't have access to anything he owns that may be in the United States, and it's now a crime to conduct any financial transactions with him. Then the next month, September, a major drone attack occurred at the Saudi Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, including the world's largest oil processing plant. The attack stopped more than half of the oil production in Saudi Arabia. This was a big deal. Yemen's Houthis, who again are in an active violent war with Saudi Arabia, claimed responsibility. They said, "We did it." But Mike Pompeo blamed Iran, again providing no evidence at all. Iran again denied any involvement. Now, this was a major attack, and so the United Nations sent investigators who ended up saying, quote, "We are unable to independently corroborate that the cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles used in these attacks are of Iranian origin," unquote, which points to it being Mike Pompeo, who was likely full of shit. The month after that, October 2019, Iraqis in the southern part of Iraq had a huge protest against Iran and the unacceptable level of control Iran has over the Iraqi government. And there is an article I have in the show notes for you, along with all of my sources for all of this. But it came from the New York Times and The Intercept, and it's about the Iran cables. That's what they called this expose. In that article, one of the things I learned is that the U.S. Army recently released a study about the Iraq War and concluded, quote, an emboldened and expansionist Iran appears to be the only victor. And the article goes on to, before his death, detail how Iran, via Qasem Soleimani in particular, had a lot of influence over the decisions made by the Iraqi government in the last decade and a half. So basically, we overthrew Iraq, and Iran, in many, many ways, got control. And the Iraqis want their independence not only from us, their invaders, but from their next door neighbors as well. And so around Halloween, it was Iran who was drawing most of the Iraqis' anger, not us, for a change. Then, in November of 2019, the Iranian government unexpectedly announced that it was cutting oil subsidies to its population, which meant that the government wouldn't be helping to keep the costs of oil down as much, and Iranian peasants would have to pay 3 times more money out of pocket for their fossil fuel use. And there were huge protests in Iran. Now, the numbers are all over the place, and I trust absolutely no one, but people definitely died in those protests and in Iran's response. And so what this all means is that peasants in Iraq and Iran were protesting the Iranian government as the holidays descended upon us. Things were not looking great for the Iranian government. But on December 27th, exactly 1 week after the 2020 war authorization was signed into law, a rocket attack on Iraqi military base in Kirkuk killed a U.S. contractor who was an Iraqi who was living in Sacramento and was working for Valiant Integrated Services, which is a for-profit war profiteering company that has about 5,000 employees working in 30 states and has mercenaries deployed to more than 20 countries. A company that brings in about $650 million per year, much of that our tax money. Well, Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Esper, they blamed the attack that killed the contractor on Hezbollah brigades, which is some group of who even knows, I don't know, but this group is part of the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. Now, the Popular Mobilization Forces, it is a part of the Iraqi government. In fact, the Popular Mobilization Forces has a majority of the seats in the Iraqi parliament, but they were a bunch of random fighter groups that are now kind of squeezed together in the Iraqi government, which is still a mess. And the thing about the Popular Mobilization Forces is that they're mainly Shiite, and therefore they have that natural kinship with the Iranians that we've known for 30 years would be an issue. And so they are partners with Iran, specifically in the fight against the ISIS actual terrorist shitheads. And while we don't know if we trained any of these individuals, we do know that the Iraqi military that we have created for them have given the Popular Mobilization Forces Made in America weapons. And so the Popular Mobilization Forces are legit as far as Iraq is concerned. But regardless, 2 days after the mercenary kid from Sacramento was killed, our warmongers launched 30 rockets at 3 Popular Mobilization Forces sites. 1 was in Western Iraq and 2 were in Eastern Syria. Now, the Associated Press reported that 19 people died as a result of our rockets. Al Jazeera said it was 25. But regardless, we killed people. And before the rockets were launched, since we are in Iraq theoretically at the invitation of the Iraqi government that we installed, Defense Secretary Mark Esper called the Iraqi Prime Minister and Iraqi President and told them that the attack was coming. Both the Iraqi Prime Minister and Iraqi President told Esper that he did not have permission to launch these strikes, but they did it anyway. And by December 31st, protesters who were pissed about the bombs that we dropped without Iraq's permission in Iraq and Syria that killed 25 people, well, protesters gathered outside the U.S. embassy. And so at the end of November, protesters were mad at Iran. By the end of December, they had turned their attention back to us because of Trump's unauthorized bombs. And later that day at the embassy, after the funerals for the people killed in Iraq by our bombs, the embassy was stormed by a few dozen people. The people smashed the main door, broke security cameras, and set fire to the lobby, which is the level of protesting behavior that I have personally seen go down right down the street here in downtown Oakland. This was not on the scale of the 1979 embassy hostage thing. It was way smaller because shit like that happens here on the U.S. mainland. In fact, the Iraqi prime minister said the protesters should leave the embassy immediately. But in 1979, the government was holding the hostages. So this was very, very different. But the thing is that the security forces didn't stop the protesters from going in. So the security forces didn't put their own lives in danger to protect the American embassy from their own neighbors who were returning from 24 funerals. And so after the protesters were already in the embassy and essentially staging a sit-in, hey ho, we won't go. Eventually, what happened is members of our military and the Iraqi security forces, which is the official Iraqi military, they blasted the protesters with tear gas and the protesters left the next day. Happy New Year. That's how 2019 ended. So then on January 3rd, 2 days later, President Trump ordered a flying robot to bomb a car at the Baghdad International Airport, intentionally killing Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the second in command of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis is an Iraqi, but he fought for Iran in the Iran-Iraq War. So he's an Iraqi that was against us even when we were on Team Saddam. And when we overthrew Iraq's government in 2003, he then turned his efforts towards getting us out of his country. But because Iraq technically has its own government now, his fighters are a part of the government in Iraq, even though President Obama labeled his group as terrorists in 2009. So the Iraqi military guys who were formerly and currently known as terrorists and the military guys we trained are merging. This is messy. But the main point is that killing him can be fairly considered an attack on the Iraqi government. And he was killed alongside Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iran's Quds Force, which is basically Iranian special forces. Soleimani's forces helped us in the Afghanistan regime change, so we actually worked with this guy in the past, which is, as I said before, a partnership that ended when W labeled our partners in war as part of the axis of evil. After the 2003 Iraq regime change, he then fought against our soldiers so that Iran could have more control over the new Shiite government in Iraq. And that's a battle that still rages. So this guy was definitely fighting us. There's no way around it. And in fact, Soleimani was described by an Iraqi official in 2013 as the most powerful man in Iraq without question. And there's a fantastic article about Soleimani in the New Yorker that I have for you in the show notes if you want to find out, what was his role? Who was this guy? Why is everyone saying he was so important? He really was. More recently, Soleimani has been in charge of the Iranian fighters in Syria, and he's been working with the Syrian military to keep our regime change from happening. And Trump killed him.
We caught a total monster, and we took him out, and that should have happened a long time ago. We did it because they were looking to blow up our embassy. We also did it for other reasons that were very obvious. Somebody died. One of our military people died. People were badly wounded just a week before, and we did it. And we had a shot at him, and I took it, and that shot was pinpoint accurate, and that was the end of a monster.
And so in the aftermath, you've already heard a clip from this before, but on January 14th, the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a hearing about the assassination. And here's what the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, so Richard Haass, the club that really rules the world, he's the head of that club. Well, here's what he said about the assassination.
This event needs to be assessed from two vantage points. One is legality. It would have been justified to attack Soleimani if he was involved in mounting a military action that was imminent. If there is evidence that can responsibly be made public, supporting these criteria were met of imminence, it should be. If, however, it turns out the criteria were not met, that what took place was an action of choice rather than necessity, I fear it will lead to an open-ended conflict between the United States and Iran, fought in many places, with many tools, and few red lines that will be observed. The President tweeted yesterday that the question of imminence doesn't really matter. I would respectfully disagree. Imminence is central to the concept of preemption, which is treated in international law as a legitimate form of self-defense. Preventive attacks, though, are something very different. They are mounted against a gathering threat rather than an imminent one, and a world of regular preventive actions would be one in which conflict was prevalent.
So convincing us of imminence of a threat is key. The propaganda has to work, or else the killing would be clearly illegal, especially international law, and it would mean it's open season on everyone's elected officials. And so if the threat isn't imminent, if this was an assassination for prevention and no Trumpers go to prison for it, political assassinations by drone would now be okay in the land of the rule of law. And this explains why there is one word that the Trump administration officials, Mike Pompeo in particular, has been very careful to use when talking about the assassination this month. This is from CNN, a press conference, and Fox News.
We know it was imminent. This was an intelligence-based assessment that drove our decision-making process. We had specific information on an imminent threat, and those threat stream included attacks on U.S. embassies. Period. Full stop.
What is your definition of imminent?
This was going to happen, and American lives were at risk. And we would have been culpably negligent, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, we would have been culpably negligent had we not recommended to the president that he take this action in Qasem Soleimani. He made the right call, and America is safer as a result of that. I don't know exactly which minute. We don't know exactly which day it would have been executed, but it was very clear. Qasem Soleimani himself was plotting a broad, large-scale attack against American interests, and those attacks were imminent. Not only when I was a CI director did I see the history and then what was the current activity for the first year and a half of this administration, but when I was a member of Congress serving on the House Intelligence Committee, I saw it too. Soleimani's been a bad actor for decades in the region. He has the blood of hundreds of Americans on his hand. He's killed or contributed to the killing of hundreds of thousands of people in Syria, Muslims mostly throughout the region. This was a bad actor, and when we came to the point where we could see that he was plotting imminent attacks in the region to threaten Americans, a big attack, we recommended to the president that he take this action. The president made the right decision.
So Mike Pompeo was elected to Congress during the not at all grassroots Tea Party wave election of 2010. In Congress, like he said, he was on the House Intelligence Committee. His job was to police the secret government like the CIA. And he was also on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which gave him the job of policing companies like Koch Industries, which literally funded his campaign. Every committee has subcommittees, and Mike Pompeo was on 3 of those in the Energy and Commerce Committee. So the 3 he was on was Energy, the CIA, and he was on that whole Benghazi political circus committee. But Energy and the CIA, Mike Pompeo, partner of the oil-rich Koch brothers, was actually elected by Kansas peasants to police those things. Fox in the henhouse, faux show. And when Pompeo was allowed to write the rules that police energy companies and the CIA, the secret government wing that has already overthrown Iran once, well, when Mike Pompeo was in Congress all the way back in 2011, this is what was being told to Congress at that time. This is part of what Pompeo was hearing in Congress 9 years ago about Qasem Soleimani, the bad actor. So the person you're going to hear from right now is Raul Mark Gerecht. He was a CIA officer who recruited CIA spies from the thousands of Iranians who went to Istanbul, Turkey to recuperate during the Iran-Iraq War. And he personally met Qasem Soleimani while he was there. After his official time in the CIA, he became a director at the Project for a New American Century, which is the neoconservative warmongers who have been trying so hard to get the entire world to submit to the global economic system that allows their social group to hoard the wealth of the world. And he's currently a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, which was founded after 9/11, and it funds experts who pushed Congress to fight the war on terror. During the Trump years, this particular think tank has been helping the Trump administration with its Iran policy. And so this is the advice that Gerecht, the CIA spook, gave to Congress in 2011, 8.5 years ago, while Mike Pompeo was policing the CIA in Congress.
I mean, I have nothing against sanctions. I think there are lots of sanctions the United States should tighten. I'm in favor of most of what we might call central bank sanctions, the Iran oil-free zone. There are lots of different things you can do. But again, I just emphasize the people who rule Iran rose up essentially through killing people. All right? They have maintained a coercive system. It's become more coercive with time, not less. They do not respond in the same rational economic ways that we do. Iran would not look like the country it is today if they were concerned about the bottom line. So I don't think that you're going to really intimidate these people, get their attention, unless you shoot somebody. I don't know, it's pretty blunt, but I don't think you get around it. I think, for example, if we believe that the Guard Corps is responsible for this operation, then you should hold Qasem Soleimani responsible. Qasem Soleimani travels a lot. He's all over the place. Go get him. Either try to capture him or kill him.
And when asked about the idea of, just stopping Iran from killing our troops overseas, this is the advice he gave to Congress.
You could aggressively harass many of their operations overseas. There's no doubt about that. But you would have to have a consensus to do that. I mean, needless to say, the White House, the CIA would have to be on board to do that. You would have to have the approval to do that. We all know it's Washington, D.C. These things are difficult to do. So you may find out that this type of covert action is actually much more difficult to do than going after, say, Qasem Soleimani when he travels.
That is what was being discussed in Congress in 2011, 8.5 years ago. So while Mike Pompeo was there, he was told to do exactly what Mike Pompeo eventually did in partnership with Trump as Secretary of State. He was told that assassinations are easier because you don't have to bother with getting approval, which they didn't bother to get. He was told that you don't have to build a consensus and make your case. And there was no consensus, domestically or internationally. No one was consulted, not even Iraq, even though the bomb was to be dropped on their land. He was told to just go after Soleimani when he travels, and they killed him at the airport. This plan has been kicked around for almost 9 years. In Trump and Pompeo's explanations, you heard them rattle off a list of Soleimani's past sins, but specifics of an imminent threat that had to be taken care of with a 9-year-old assassination idea? I have my doubts. And so did Congress. And so they demanded a classified briefing to see what evidence the Trump administration had of an imminent threat to anything. The Trumpers said that the embassy was in danger, and Congress wanted to see for themselves what made them think that. Now, I don't think at this point it's safe for us to trust anything the Democrats say about Trump, to be honest. Not after that Ukraine-related impeachment fiasco. But Senator Mike Lee of Utah is on Team Republican. He voted to acquit Trump of the impeachment charges, and he voted against witnesses. He's on the team. But here's what he said to reporters right outside the door of that classified hearing where he was, in theory, supposed to be presented with evidence of an imminent threat by Mike Pompeo, Mark Esper, and another military war maker, Mark Milley.
They're appearing before a coordinate branch of government responsible for their funding, for their confirmation, for any approval of any military action they might undertake. And they had to leave after 75 minutes while they're in the process of telling us that we need to be good little boys and girls and run along and not debate this in public. I find that absolutely insane. I think it's unacceptable. And so I don't know what they had in mind. I went in there hoping to get more specifics as far as the factual, legal, moral justification for what they did. I'm still undecided on that issue, in part because we never got to the details. Every time we got close, they'd say, well, we can't discuss that here because it's really sensitive. We're in a skiff. We're in a secure underground bunker where all electronic devices have to be checked at the door, and they still refuse to tell us. I find that really upsetting.
And on top of that, we found out that after the fact, that the same day of the Soleimani assassination at the Baghdad airport on January 3rd, the Trump administration also tried to drone kill another Iranian Quds Force commander in Yemen, but they hit the wrong guy. And so if the imminent threat was related to Soleimani in Iraq, why did they attempt an assassination at the same time in Yemen? The coordinated assassinations of Iranians in 2 countries at the same time suggests that this was planned in advance. It wasn't a case of stopping an imminent threat like an incoming bomb in Soleimani's briefcase, which is what imminence looks like to most of us. And the coordinated assassination suggests that there was a bigger goal, changing the leadership in Iran by killing some of their leaders. And this is classic shock doctrine. When economic war isn't working, the violent regime change begins. And let's keep in mind that last year, Congress, both branches, passed a resolution requiring the Trump administration to stop helping the Saudis with their regime change war in Yemen. Trump vetoed it, but Congress, for the first time since this podcast has existed, has voted to stop our involvement in a war, the Yemen war. And Trump just killed someone, the wrong someone, which somehow no one cares about, with a flying robot in Yemen, a country that we're not technically at war with. You know, at what point is Congress going to draw the line here with these lawless war makers in the executive branch? They should be impeaching him for this, because their authority is definitely not being respected. But Because in this year's NDAA, in the 2020 war authorization that became law 2 weeks before the bombings in Iraq and Yemen against the Iranian leaders, the only thing Congress put in the war authorization specifically related to Iran is section 1284 that says, quote, nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act may be construed to authorize the use of military force, including the use of military force against Iran or any other country, unquote. So military force against Iran was specifically not authorized in this year's war authorization. And it's not just the U.S. Congress that's not being respected by the Trump administration. It's the Iraqi version of Congress, too. Because 2 days after the assassinations on January 5th, Iraq's parliament, so their version of Congress, voted to kick the U.S. troops out of Iraq. Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced that the Trump administration doesn't give a shit what the Iraqis want us to do, and we're staying. But unlike the Trump administration's attacks on Iran's leaders, the ignoring of the wishes of the Iraqi leaders is perfectly in line with what Congress officially wants, according to the NDAA. Because Section 1221 withholds at least half of the $645 million authorized by the 2015 defense authorization for military and other security forces associated with the government of Iraq. They can't get half that money until the Defense Department submits an estimate of the funding that they're going to need in creating the Iraqi security forces through September of 2025. And so what that means is that Congress intends for us to stay there, building Iraq a military, using our military for at least the next 5 years. And another provision backs up this conclusion, while at the same time limiting what our money can pay for. So Section 1223 allows $30 million for the Office of Security Cooperation in Iraq. And that's a $15 million funding cut. And this is an authorization that's going to sunset, so it's going to be over. They have to give them that money by March of 2020, so that's pretty soon. And the provision also eliminates the authority for the Defense Department to pay for construction and renovation of facilities. But even though the $30 million is allowed to be given to the Office of Security Cooperation in Iraq, they can't get 2/3 of that money until they create a 5-year security assistance roadmap that enables defense institution building and reform. And I don't know what kind of reforms we're holding this money over their heads for. But clearly, Congress wants to see plans from both sides, from the U.S. military and the Iraqis, for the next 5 years of our presence in the country. But the funding law for the Defense Department puts some new restrictions on what can be done there, because Section 9007 says that no funds from this year's funding or any other law can be used to, quote, establish any military installation or base for the purpose of providing for the permanent stationing of United States forces in Iraq, unquote, or to, quote, exercise United States control over any oil resource in Iraq, unquote. And so this is confusing to me, because how are we supposed to stay for 5 years if the military isn't allowed to do so for the purposes of staying permanently? Like, what's going on in here? How is our military staying, but also being told that eventually we're going to have to leave? Like, I don't get it. Well, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, he gave us a clue for what might be the plan for Iraq in that hearing on January 14th.
The other thing I think you heard from all three of us is the importance of repairing the U.S.-Iraqi relationship. I mean, think about it. Qasem Soleimani's principal goal was to drive the United States out of Iraq. Why in the world would we want to facilitate his success there after his death? We ought to make sure that doesn't happen. And Steve Hadley gave, I thought, a lot of good ideas about ways we could signal almost to help the Iraqi government manage the Iraqi politics. We could also look at some creative things. When I was in the Pentagon years ago, when we were building what became Central Command, we used to look at the idea of presence without stationing. There's ways to have a regular force presence without necessarily having forces be permanent. This may help the Iraqi government manage the politics of it without a serious diminution of our capabilities.
Presence without stationing. So our military would be there, but not officially on a base. Like, they're not really there if they're staying at a hotel. Now, obviously, I have no way to know exactly. I mean, that's a guess. I don't know exactly what presence without stationing would look like in reality. But this is something we need to keep in mind as we go forward, staying in Iraq without their permission. This seems to be the way they're setting up to do it. Like, we're there, but we're going to pretend we're not. And I should note that the military is still allowed to operate in Iraq, quote, to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And so Section 9006 of the funding law allows the military to, quote, provide supplies, services, transportation, including airlift and sea lift, and other logistical support to allied forces, unquote, for anti-ISIS operations. And the funding law provides over $1.1 billion for the Counter-ISIS Train and Equip Fund, which is money that can go to, quote, foreign security forces, irregular forces, groups, or individuals, unquote. So just groups, any individuals. So that's $1 billion that can go to anywhere. And last, Section 1210A allows the Defense Department to give the State Department and USAID money for, quote, stabilization activities, unquote, in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. So the wiggle room and funding for presence without stationing in Iraq is definitely there. And when this wiggle room is used, apparently this current Congress is not too worried about the hearts and minds of those affected anymore, because with Section 1208 of the NDAA, Congress eliminated the authorization for payments that started in late 2016 for, quote, damage, personal injury, or death that is incident to combat operations of the armed forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Libya, and Yemen, unquote. So we're not going to compensate people for the deaths that we cause anymore. You guys... we're monsters, or Congress is making us look like monsters. I know I don't want this to happen. I don't want us to be there and killing people on accident to begin with. And I sure as don't want them to get nothing from us when it happens. Like, God, I hate this Congress. I really, really do. And even though there are a lot of countries on that list of places where we're killing people on the reg, let's finish up this episode with Syria, because Iran is all up in that situation. And Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina got Mike Pompeo to admit one of the reasons why in a hearing that took place last April.
Do you agree with me that having a stabilizing force in northeastern Syria will prevent Iran from coming down and taking over the oil?
It is an important part of our overall Middle East strategy, including our counter-Iran strategy.
So containing Iran would including having a policy in Syria that would keep them from benefiting from our withdrawal.
That's right. It's one piece of it. Yes,
okay.
Senator.
So oil. And we've known that for, 5 years now, that fossil fuels were a factor in the Obama administration's regime change attempts in Syria. And if that sentence doesn't make perfect sense to you, check out episode 108 from 2015, when the Obama administration admitted over and over again that they were trying to overthrow the government of Syria. And then check out episode 172, which I produced when Trump illegally bombed the government of Syria back in 2018 and was never impeached for it. But now that we know for sure that oil is a part of the Trump administration's Syria calculations as well, which is not surprising, but at least we know it for sure, we also need to know that another factor in our involvement in Syria, according to this Congress, is Israel. Because Section 5521 of the NDAA says, quote, it is the sense of Congress that regardless of the ultimate number of United States military personnel deployed to Syria, it is a vital interest of the United States to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hezbollah, and other Iranian-backed forces from establishing a strong and enduring presence in Syria that can be used to project power in the region and threaten the United States and its allies, including Israel, unquote. Then the NDAA requires a report within 6 months that will include how Iran is military training and funding the Syrian government led by President Bashar al-Assad, and the threat that Iran's forces pose to, quote, areas of northeast Syria that are currently controlled by local partner forces of the United States, unquote. And those are the terrorist groups that we've been funding so that they will fight to overthrow their government. The report must also outline, quote, how Iran and Iranian-backed forces seek to enhance the long-term influence of such entities in Syria through non-military means, such as purchasing strategic real estate in Syria, constructing Shia religious centers in schools, securing loyalty from Sunni tribes in exchange for material assistance, money, bribes, and inducing the Assad government to open Farsi language departments at Syrian universities, unquote. So that's the stuff that Iran is doing that we're pissed at them for. And then the NDAA assumes that the Iranian goals in Syria are, quote, protecting the Assad government, increasing the regional influence of Iran, threatening Israel from a more proximate location, building weapon production facilities and other military infrastructure, and securing a land bridge to run through Iraq and Syria to the stronghold of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, unquote. So a main reason that the Masters of the Universe want us to prevent Iran from having their axis of resistance partnership in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon is because Israel's dominance would be threatened. You know, we protect Israel like it's the 51st state, and we might as well make them one so that Israelis can at least chip in and pay some taxes for the regime changes that we're orchestrating for them. I mean, this shit's expensive. And I don't understand why we're doing all of this for another country that isn't us. But anyway, back to regime changes. That's still the goal in Syria, according to this NDAA. But there are some changes coming, and these are interesting, assuming that Trump will follow the law, which is a big if. But Congress intends for there to be some changes for our official strategy in overthrowing Syria. So first of all, how do we know that regime change is still the bipartisan goal of the monsters in this Congress? Well, we know because of S-52, which was dingleberried into law in the NDAA. S-52 is the Caesar-Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019, whose main author was Senator James Risch of Idaho, who has taken over $30,000 from people affiliated with General Atomics, the war profiteering company that makes the MQ-9 Predator drones of death that we have purchased to bomb the shit out of Syria. He's also taken over $100,000 from people in the defense industry as a whole, and over $166,000 from people in the pro-Israel lobby, which, how in the hell is that not considered foreign interference in our elections? Giving money to our congressmen. Because it is. It absolutely is. But because it's Israel, it doesn't count. And I don't understand that, but whatever. The point is that the author of this dingleberried into law bill has taken shitloads of money from pro-Israel war profiteers, and he introduced this basically first thing in the new Congress last year. It was clearly a priority. Oh, and I should mention that it had 3 co-sponsors, Senator Todd Young of Indiana, and of course, little Marco Rubio of Florida, and his best buddy in war, Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Because wherever there's a war, you'll find those two in their cheerleading outfits. And what their bill, law, says is that it's now U.S. policy to, quote, support a transition to a government in Syria that respects the rule of law, human rights, and peaceful coexistence with its neighbors, unquote, neighbors like Israel. But transition to a government in Syria, that's regime change. And the strategy is shifting, though, back to economic war. So what the NDAA says is by June of this year, the Secretary of the Treasury, so the filthy rich shady banker Steve Mnuchin, he has to determine, quote, whether reasonable grounds exist for concluding that the Central Bank of Syria is a financial institution of primary money laundering concern, unquote. The bill then assumes that the answer will be yes, and then Mnuchin shall, so he has to, impose so-called special measures that could require banks to retain more records about transactions in Syria. They could give the government information about the people who conduct financial transactions with people in Syria, and they're allowed to prohibit U.S. banks from opening accounts for and conducting transactions for Syrian banks, which are special measures that sound a lot like sanctions to me. Also by June, the puppet masters of President Trump have to submit a strategy to Congress to stop all humans and companies on Earth from entering into reconstruction contracts in the areas of Syria under the control of the government of Syria. And so for the last at least 6 years, we have funded the destruction of Syria, and now we're going to prevent them from rebuilding. And so if the goal is to make the Syrian people so miserable that they overthrow their own government, forcing them to live in rubble, I could do it. And I think that's the goal. And this authorization is also valid for 5 years. But that said, there is a provision in here that I consider a good thing, because for years we've been giving money and weapons to the opposition in Syria, the moderate rebels, who are also known as random terrorists, so that they could overthrow their government. Well, this year's defense authorization kind of puts a stop to that because it changes the authorization from 2015 that allowed the Defense Department to train, equip, supply, give money to, and construct facilities for the Syrian opposition. So the funding for rando terrorists is finally being cut off, or at least Congress intends for it to be. But the loophole is that the new language allows money and weapons to be given to people if they are fighting ISIS or Al-Qaeda, although it does limit the kinds of weapons that can be given to these Syrian groups to, quote, small arms or light weapons, unquote. And I don't know how that's defined. But of course, there's also a way for the defense secretary to waive the limit. So they kind of cut off funding for the rando terrorists, but I don't know if they actually did with all the loopholiness, but thought I'd tell you about it anyway. But that's some of our future in war. So basically, Congress wants us to stay in Iraq for 5 years. They want us to continue to try to overthrow President Assad of Syria for the next 5 years. And Congress is not looking for a war in Iran, even though one might be coming. Because 2 days after Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran fully pulled out of the nuclear deal. So even with the other countries, they just said, nope, we're done. We're going to build a nuclear weapon. bye-bye. And then instead of trying to use diplomacy, the next day, so they pull out of the nuclear deal. This is probably the day when we need to talk to Iran the most. The very next day, the Trump administration denied the Iranian foreign minister a visa that would have let him attend the United Nations Security Council meeting in New York, which is a very big deal. Because in 1947, when the world agreed that these meetings of world leaders would be held in the United States, we were required to let all the diplomats in so that they could go to the meetings. And so here the world was trying to solve problems with words just 3 days after some assassinations. And one of the main players in this game of death wasn't allowed to the table. And it's yet another example of our government doing whatever the fuck it wants, the rest of the world be damned. And so since they literally were not allowed to participate in talks with the world 2 days later, after some really scary macho bullshit coming from the tweets of our president, the Iranians launched 22 missiles at the U.S. bases in Iraq where the assassination drones were launched from. Now, the missiles didn't kill anyone, although CNN has reported that 64 American service members have traumatic brain injuries from the explosions. But big picture, the Iranian foreign minister, the one who wasn't allowed to come here to talk to the world leaders, he tweeted, quote, Iran took and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense under Article 51 of UN Charter, targeting the base from where the cowardly armed attack against our citizens and senior officials were launched, unquote. So Iran took and concluded proportionate measures. And then Trump tweeted in his response, so far so good. And so with those two sentences, even though diplomacy was squashed 2 days before, those of us who were paying attention breathed for the first time in a week. They concluded that it was over, but for now. Although that's no consolation to the 167 innocent people whose airplane was accidentally shot out of the sky on the night that Iran launched those missiles. Iran said that the plane was mistaken for an incoming missile after it took off from the airport, but it just shows you that us peasants are not immune to wars. Although it really feels like we are with the relative peace that we have here on the U.S. mainland. Peace that we will have until all the weapons that we've sold to the world get turned in our direction if we continue this shit, which all signs point to us doing. Because we've been at war in multiple countries for damn near 20 years now, and there's no real anti-war movement in this country. And I 100% believe that's because we don't have a draft. So none of us really feel all that afraid of actually dying in these wars. Because the military right now, when it comes to the draft, is an all-volunteer force consisting of about 1.2 million people in the actual military, plus I have absolutely no idea how many people in the war profiteering industries, the contractors, the mercenaries. But every one of those people signs up for it. They know what they're getting into, in theory at least, and they sign up by choice, each person with their own motivations. The last time that people like you and I were forced into the military was during the Vietnam War, but that's not allowed anymore legally. And so to change that, Congress would have to pass a new law restarting the draft, and the president would have to sign it. And so as of right now, we can't be drafted. But this is why it's important to watch what Congress is doing. And it's another reminder that they have the power to literally affect our lives to the point of forcing you to sign up to fight and possibly die in these wars that so far, American peasants have been mostly able to ignore. But just because there is not right now a law authorizing a draft, there's a list on standby in case a draft is quickly authorized by Congress and the president, which is possible. We've seen bills with over 2,000 pages become law in less than 2 days. And so the people on the list are all men who have registered with the Selective Service System, which is most American men over the age of 18, because you boys are required to, by law, to register. And if you've ever applied for student aid or gotten a driver's license in this country, you're on the list. And let's just point out that this is unequal. You know, women have not had to register for the draft, which this particular woman is just fine with. I don't want to register. I don't want to go to war. And so I am fine with this particular brand of inequality. But it might not stay unequal for long, because the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service is currently working on a final report that is expected to be released in March, which will determine if women are going to be required now to register for the draft. You know, we all wanted equality, ladies. Now we're all expected to work corporate jobs and raise the families, and now we might get to go to war. Equality. Be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. But the good news is that the masters of the universe, they really don't seem to be itching for a war with Iran or even a regime change. Not right now, anyway. So here's Richard Haass one more time, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the head puppet masters of the World Order show, giving Congress instructions for what the masters want to see going forward.
Let me just make a few recommendations, and I know my time is growing short. One, the United States should work closely with its allies and other signatories of the JCPOA to put together the outlines of a new agreement. Call it JCPOA 2.0 and present Iran with a new deal. It would establish longer-term, or better yet, open-ended limits on Iran's nuclear missile programs in exchange for sanctions relief. Congress should approve any such agreement to remove the concern that this pact could be easily undone by any president, and such initiatives should emerge from consultation with allies. Our policy toward Iran has become overly unilateral and is less effective for it.
So the masters of the universe are talking about peace deals and working with other countries to make it happen. That's a good sign if we can make it through this last Trump year. Assuming that this will be the last Trump year, because I refuse to believe that we peasant voters are dumb enough to allow this to continue for any longer than that. But there's also some hope to be found in this Congress, because at the end of January, the House, and only the House, the Republican warmongers in charge of the Senate won't even allow these bills to come up for a vote. But the House did pass the No War Against Iran Act, which would have blocked funding for using military force in Iran without pre-approval from Congress. That passed 228 to 175, with most Democrats saying yes. The three war-loving Democrats that voted no on this were former Marine Representative Connor Lamb of Pennsylvania, corporate Democrat Representative Ben Adams of Utah, and corporate Democrat with $65,000 in Lockheed and Raytheon stock, Representative Kurt Schrader of Oregon. So let's fire those f***s along with almost the entire Republican Party, who basically voted to allow Trump to go to war in Iran without pre-approval from Congress. Like, that's not only a warmongery thing to do, but it's also diminishing the power of the branch of government you work for. So, bye. But then also on the same day, the House passed a bill that would have repealed the 2002 authorization for the use of military force that launched the war in Iraq. And that AUMF is what Trump used as his very shaky legal justification for killing Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. And it wasn't just Qasem Soleimani. There were 9 other people that he blew up at the Baghdad airport. So this one, to repeal the Iraq war authorization for military force, that one got even more support. It passed 236 to 166. And this one was also not a straight party line vote. Almost all Democrats, to their credit, voted to finally stop the Iraq war. There were only 2 Democrats this time that are against that idea, and they were, again, former Marine Connor Lamb of Pennsylvania, who apparently wants to keep our troops in harm's way even longer, and corporate Democrat Representative Jim Cooper of Tennessee, who should be fired along with almost the entire Republican Party. Now, 11 Republicans this time voted to end the Iraq war, but there were only 3 who voted yes on both of these, and therefore might be worth keeping in Congress if you give a hot damn about ending the wars. The 3 Republicans that said yes to all of this were Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio, Matt Gaetz of Florida, and Tom Massey of Kentucky. The rest of the Republicans can be retired because they voted to allow Trump to launch a war with Iran on his own and to continue the Iraq war indefinitely. They have got to go. Although, even though we have some good guys in this story, they're not exactly good guys. Like Representative Ro Khanna of California. He's the guy that wrote the bill that would have stopped Trump from launching a war in Iran because he's in a bad mood or because Fox News tells him to. That's a good thing, writing that bill. But if Trump does have a World War III inducing hissy fit, Ro Khanna has $376,000 worth of stock in war profiteering companies, including Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. So he's against the war, but he's fine with profiting from it. And he's not the only Democrat in the House who makes money betting on war profiteers. Steve Cohen of Tennessee has $415,000 in war profiteer stock. Jerry Connolly of Virginia has $400,000 of war profiteer stock. Debbie Dingell of Michigan, $300,000. Joe Kennedy, the ginger darling of Massachusetts, has $150,000 in war profiteer stock. David Price of North Carolina, $100,000. Thomas Suzy of New York, $100,000. There are 36 members of the House of Representatives who are betting on and profiting off of war in the stock market, with more Democrats and a bunch of Republicans. But we're firing all the Republicans anyway for voting for war, so I'm not going to waste my breath naming them. But the person in Congress who makes the most money from war is hands down Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California with her $650,000 in Boeing stock. There are 15 senators, 15% of the Senate, who profit from war, which is another sadly bipartisan list. And the thing is, like, I don't want this to be an episode where, or anytime, I don't want to just say, here's a million problems and go along your way. Like, I feel the need to suggest something that we can do to fix it. But unfortunately, all I've got, and I know I sound like a broken record with this, but the solution is to fire them all. Just a big anti-incumbent wave. Just bye-bye, both parties. You know, there are a few good eggs in this Congress, but they aren't effective enough to warrant protecting them from the wave. So I say, let's just tsunami the whole damn Congress, because we owe it to the world to get our shit together and get this war machine under control. You know? Because, all right, so this has been on my mind the entire time I've been researching the NDAA. Because while I was producing this episode, Kobe Bryant died. And longtime listeners know that I am a Boston sports fan. But my Boston-raised parents moved us to Southern California when I was 6 years old. And so Boston teams have my allegiance in 3 out of the 4 major sports, as is required in my family. But I rebelled with one sport, basketball. And that's because I've been a legit Laker fan for 20 years, and that's because of Kobe Bryant. And actually, part of my fandom came from the fact that he married a girl my age who went to a nearby high school. The closest I ever got to her is that I stood behind Vanessa Lane Bryant, in the snack line at a game, and I eavesdropped on her conversation for about 20 minutes when we were still in high school. That's the most interaction I ever had with her. But I've been aware of what happened in that girl's life ever since. You know, most stand in the snack line people I never see or think of again, but Vanessa Lane married my favorite basketball player, and I've always wished her well. And she lost Kobe and her daughter, and I can't even. So I've really felt this loss. It hard. I cried a lot over it, and I felt really silly. In fact, I asked Joe if it was nuts to be crying over someone I don't really know. But I obviously wasn't alone in this. You know, even people who hated Kobe Bryant, everyone felt for Gianna and the rest of the people in that helicopter. You know, the whole damn country has been sad. And so now that the dust has settled a bit, it's been about 2 weeks, I think about that sadness, that countrywide sadness, maybe global sadness, but definitely here in the United States. And you guys, we are causing so many people to feel that sadness of tragic deaths regularly. And there's such a disconnect there. You know, like, I know we're good people. We care about people. Otherwise, we wouldn't have grieved like that when Kobe and everyone else died in that helicopter. But how can we also be the people that chip in to pay to kill so many others and just not do everything we can to stop it? I don't understand that. And so the thing is, I think a lot of us want to stop it, but the way that we do it is that we have to get our government back from the business above all else war profiteers that we've given the power to make our laws. We need a major change in Congress, even more than we need one in the White House, because Congress authorized all these wars, and only Congress can truly stop them. And unfortunately, I've only scratched the surface of this defense authorization for this year in this episode. This was only related to 3 countries. In the next episode, I'm going to look into our situation with every other country named in this war authorization law. And so far, I have 17 other countries on my list, but there's likely more hidden in those 1,119 pages. And as you can imagine, this work is hard, largely sucks, but it's important. And so if you want to be a part of this effort, please support the show with your marketing talents, because we can't do shit about any of this if only a few thousand people know about it, but also by paying for the show, because my business model is based on value. So I provide you with information that you know you're not getting anywhere else, and you pay what it's worth to you. And the only number that I truly consider unfair is 0. Every other number is truly needed and appreciated. And you can find links to all our donation methods, Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, all of them in every episode's show notes, along with all of my sources, because trust is earned. And that's the relationship I want to have with you. One of collaboration and trust. And because of that, I'm never going to sell your valuable time to advertisers, because that's not what partners do. You're my business partner, and I thank you in advance for doing your part. And so that's it for today. I am not sure when the next episode will be out. The research for these war episodes right now, it is brutal. And the thing is that I know that delays in episodes costs me all the Patreon money. So trust me, I'm doing these as fast as I can. But this year, my goal is to produce the best episodes I can, even if it costs me money, because I'm a financial masochist who just really likes the deep end of the rabbit holes. So until I can finish this, take care of yourself and please spread the word about the podcast and chat with me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at Jen Briney in both places. But yeah, enjoy your day. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright. In the end, he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.